example, that is going to work in the region where you're at? Does it meet the chilling hour requirements? Does it meet the heat unit requirements? So a lot of forethought should have gone into what you've planted. Now you've got the tree into the ground, or maybe you've inherited a house. Maybe you've moved to a place where the trees have been there for a long time. We have different degrees of pruning. Are we talking about pruning newly established trees? Are we trying to get these trees off to a good start? Are we in a middle range of the tree's life where the tree's been producing? Now it needs some work. Are we at a more advanced stage of the life in the tree? Is the tree older? Has it been in the family? Has it been in the yard for a long time? Is there an emotional attachment to that tree? Was that tree planted as a memorandum for a grandparent, or even the birth of a child or a grandchild? Maybe that's why you have the fruit tree. It's been in the family for so long. There's an emotional significance attached to that tree. So depending upon the circumstances, it's going to dictate what the goals and what the objectives are of the pruning. I'll also start by saying any pruning cut is going to wound the tree. There's no doubt about it. It's going to have it's going to be, the tree is going to, not that the tree has consciousness, but it's going to be, the tree is going to react to the pruning wound, the removal of the branch or the shortening of the branch in a specific way. The fruit trees left naturally without our interference, their tendency is to want to grow tall, outcompete their neighbors, and have their fruit up away in the upper reaches of the canopy or out on the edges. And it's thought that the two reasons for this are, one, it makes the fruit more available to the animals that can reach it, the birds and the squirrels, the rodents, things like that. And if the fruit is out on the edges, when it falls, the seeds are going to go into the ground, and they're going to be far enough away from the main stem or the mother tree so as not to compete with the parent tree for resources. That's what the tree naturally wants to do. Now we inject the human factor into this equation, and now we're asking the trees to do maybe something that's not natural to it. Maybe now we're asking the trees to produce a more numerous quantity of fruit, larger fruit, fruit not necessarily out at the ends, but brought internally, maybe an equal distribution of fruit throughout the tree. So in order to do that, we as humans, we have to modify, we have to intervene. And the first thing that we want to take into consideration is, will the branch of the tree be strong enough to support the fruit that we're asking it to grow? And we talk about angles of attachment between branches and trunks. And the general rule of thumb is a minimum angle of attachment between a trunk and a branch, minimum would be 30 degrees, a 30-degree angle. Ideal would be 45 to 90. There are even cases where perhaps you have a weeping tree and you might even want a obtuse angle, and maybe even 120 degrees. But the reason why we're wanting this angle, or why we're so concerned as pruners about this angle of attachment, is we want the branch to be strong. We want it to be strong enough to be able to hold the load of fruit that we're asking that branch to produce. And when we have a narrow angle, there's a tendency for that joint or that union between the branch and the trunk to be weak. And what weakens it is as we know, any stem, as it grows, not only does it elongate, but it's going to expand in girth. It also puts out bark, generally speaking. So when we have two stems that are doing that, eventually, if we have a narrow angle, the bark, the included bark on both of those stems is going to start to interfere. It's going to start to get crushed. It's also going to weaken that joint. So we really try as much as possible to have at least 30-degree angles of attachment with our branch to trunk unions. And additionally, we talk about branch aspect ratio, where the ideal scenario is we have the branch being about 1/3 the diameter of the trunk that it's attached to. As much as possible, we try to maintain that. So that's really the first thing, is the architecture of the tree. Can the tree support the weight of the fruit that we expect it to produce? Then, in line with that, in most cases, we're going to have what's called, at that branch trunk interface, we're going to have what's called a branch collar. And that's a swelling. That's actually the fibers of the trunk are encircling the fibers on the branch, and it goes towards making like a ball and socket type connection. But that's a critical, just in terms of making a pruning cut, that's a critical area to target. A lot of times you'll be able to see, as we're walking around, we can point it out, the branch collar, but it's a swelling. It'll be a pronounced swelling around the base of the branch where it interfaces with the trunk. The reason why we're targeting that, and we want to find that, is if we are making a pruning cut, and if we are making what's called a thinning pruning cut, to where we're removing that branch back to the stem or the trunk, we want to make our cut outside the branch collar. And there's a reason for that. It's thought that inside the branch collar, there are meristematic cells that are able to respond to the removal of a branch. They have antimicrobial compounds, growth is stimulated, there is a wound response that happens, and just a quick note, a lot of times you'll hear this term, the tree healed the wound. The tree heals pruning wounds. That's a misnomer, and a lot of people in the arboricultural profession, we don't take offense to that, but we'd rather use the term seal. And maybe it's potato or potato, but we really prefer to say that the tree is sealing the wound as opposed to healing the wound. But that's where we want to target our cut. So it's very important, keeping in mind that any pruning cut is a wound on the tree. So again, we're asking the tree to do what it's not naturally inclined to do. So if we're going to be interfering or intervening with the tree's natural process, we need to minimize our impact. So minimizing our impact means when we're making a pruning cut, we're going to try to make it so that the tree can use its natural responses to seal that wound. Let's see. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Also, the size of the wound is important. The smaller, the better, or the size of the cut. I keep saying wound. What I mean is the wound that we're creating by making the pruning cut. The smaller the cut, the easier of a time the tree is going to have sealing that over. So if we don't know what that branch collar is, and if we think, oh, we need to make a flush cut, a lot of times we are, not only are we eliminating that meristematic tissue that's instrumental in the tree being able to seal the wound, we're making a larger cut than is necessary. We're asking the tree to spend more energy basically fixing our mistake that we made by pruning in the first place. Another way you can identify this branch collar is when you look at almost any union, you'll see what we call the branch bark ridge. And a lot of time, that's crushed xylem tissue, and it forms kind of a raised surface at that joint. So if you're having a hard time finding the branch collar, you can generally locate the branch bark ridge, and then the branch collar is going to be in close proximity to that ridge. Another thing is we talk about sometimes we have stems. It's a multi-stem that's originating from one point. We're getting a divergence, and one of those two stems needs to be removed for whatever reason. Maybe it's competing. Maybe it's their two leaders competing, and that's creating a problem. We only want to have one. We only want to designate one. A lot of times, particularly with pears, with our palm fruits, we're having a lot of upright growth. We're having what's called narrow crossing angles, and so in the case I just described was a nice case where we can prune a branch at the branch collar at the trunk. What happens when we have two stems? Well, first of all, there's not going to be any, if you cut one of the two stems, I'm drawing a difference between the stem and the branch now, there's not going to be a sealing over of the stem. So if you're really wanting to remove a stem, you have to be cognizant of the fact that that's not going to seal over. It's not going to form callous wood that's going to seal that wound because it doesn't have the branch collar. It's okay to do it, but you just have to be aware. And so keeping in mind, it's better, we talk about a young tree, it's much better to be doing these cuts, these big, or these cuts that have major repercussion. Much better to do it when the tree's young. When you're making a smaller cut, you're making a smaller wound, so the tree has a much easier time dealing with that. But I do want to point out, in the case of the two stems, and if you determine that one of those two stems have to be removed for whatever reason, maybe the angle of attachment is too narrow, again, you have competing leaders. Sometimes, rather than making a thinning cut and removing one of the stems entirely, you can subordinate. If it's early enough in the process, you can make one of those two subordinate to the leader. But if you're forced to actually make that cut and remove that stem, what you're wanting to do is, you can oftentimes still find a branch bark ridge there. You can find that ridge, and you can make a 45-degree cut, from 45-degree angle from that ridge at that junction, and that's where you can cut your stem. You wouldn't want to make a flat cut. The reason why you wouldn't want to make a flat cut is because you're making it susceptible to having water sit on top of that flat surface. So if you are going to make a cut, keeping in mind that you want to make as small a wound as possible, it's better to have it angled. You don't want to have it angled too much, nor do you want to have it angled too little, but you do want to have a nice enough angle so where any water, any moisture that could possibly collect up there can drain off. This leads into, what do we do with our pruning cuts? Do we let the tree seal it over? Are there compounds that we can use? You can go to a nursery, you can go to a hardware store, and they'll be happy to sell you wound sealant. And generally speaking, what we find is we don't want to use the wound sealant. We'd rather let the tree's natural chemical processes take over, their natural reaction, the natural wood tissue that the tree is going to form in response. We'd rather do that than use a wound sealant. It's also thought that the wound sealant can trap pathogens to you. Generally speaking, my experience, most of the people that I work with in the arboricultural profession, we do not recommend that. One caveat to that, one exception. I had a teacher once who told me, Jeff, nature is not black and white, it's gray. So there are never any absolutes, there are never any certainties. There's always, you have to arm yourself with as much information as possible and sift through that information and find the information that's relevant or pertinent to you. But there have been circumstances where we talk about making a wound, and maybe that wound in the tree is directed in such a way that it's getting a majority of sunlight during a hot time of summer or just throughout the year. If the tree doesn't get up and go and start processing that wound could be susceptible to drying out. So there have been instances where we talk about painting the tree with a white latex paint, a watered down interior white latex paint. We talk about that on thin bark trees to prevent against sun scald or sunburn. There have been instances where it might be warranted that you would paint a wound on a tree. But if you do so, please keep in mind it's not as if you're putting a wound sealant on that. You're just trying to protect that wound from drying out. So there's the example of nature not being black or white. No, you never use pruning sealant. There's an exception to that. So are there any questions thus far? You in the back.
What's the difference between a stem and a branch?
The question was, what was the difference between a stem and a branch?
The question is, what's the difference between a stem and a branch? I'm using the word stem to be synonymous with trunk, but a branch is usually a stem that is arising from a trunk. So you have a central column, a central trunk, and then coming out laterally from that are going to be branches. But what if that trunk splits off and that trunk turns into 4 or 5 different stems or trunks? It's still a trunk, but you would call it you could call it a trunk. I just call it a stem. I try to. I'm sorry for the confusion. I'm just saying that a stem, I typically correlate that to be a trunk. That's my that's how I do it.
So is it normally like if you've got the trunk coming up and you cut, that the stems come off the top of the trunk as opposed to the sides?
The question is, if you cut the trunk, the reactive growth that arises as a result of that, are those stems or are those trunks? Depending upon when you do it, I would still say it's going to be a trunk. It's still going to be a stem.
Question is, you talked about the ideal crotch angles for the branches coming out. Does that vary depending on the type of fruit tree, like apple versus peach versus fig, persimmon, things like that? Are there some that you really want to make sure you get a very wide crotch angle, and some where it doesn't really matter that as much?
Excellent question. The question was, are there, in talking about branch and trunk angles, are there certain instances where you may want to have a larger angle as opposed to a narrower angle? Yes. If you are growing a heavy fruit, if you're growing persimmons or avocados or peaches, it would be ideal to have a branch that's going to be able to support that weight. It doesn't have to even be the size, it can also be the quantity of the fruit. If the fruit is cherries, if there's an abundant amount, anything that's going to be heavy, and particularly where is that fruit coming, where along the length of that branch is that fruit coming? Is it concentrated at the ends? Is it in the middle? Is it spread uniformly throughout? Those are some of the considerations that you would like. Which leads into a good point, and I'm sorry if I'm all over the place with this. This is my second time doing this, so please bear with me. So we're asking the tree to be unnatural, to sort of like, oh, you want a tree, maybe the type of fruit that you're growing, maybe you want the ideal angle for that particular branch you need would be 90 degrees. But if it's a tree that's inherently an upright tree, you're going to have quite a hard time. You're going to be fighting. It's going to be like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. You're going to be putting a lot of time and energy into doing something that the tree doesn't want to do, and ultimately the tree may win. Your efforts may be in vain. But we talk about pruning, and maybe I should save this for the end, but if I don't bring it up now, I'll probably forget. We don't always have to prune. There are, particularly in the early stages of a tree, we can, pruning is not necessarily, there's many things. Improve the crotch angle, make the branch strong enough to support the weight of the tree. Maybe we want to direct the growth of the tree in a particular way. That might necessitate pruning some branches away. There's another reason why we prune. But we don't always have to make pruning. We don't, if possible, maybe we can make the tree work for us. Maybe when the tree's young enough, we can direct the branch or the branches to grow in a particular way. And that might be, maybe we're using a band. Maybe we have a 1-inch wide band wrapped around the branch in question, and we direct that. We can have a band that might be anchored into the ground, and we can encourage that tree to form that shape without even having to prune. Obviously, it's better to do that when the tree's young, when it's getting established, but that is an option to pruning. Any other questions about that? Okay, let's see. Pruning cuts, height reduction.
Yeah.
Okay. Depending upon the demand, the expectation that you have for your tree, there's different things that we can, if you're limited. Okay, let's talk about space and size. There's a general perception out there, in terms of trees, bigger is better. Everyone thinks, oh yeah, the bigger the tree, the more the fruit. Well, I think that probably is true, but then it becomes a matter of accessibility. We would typically, it doesn't make sense to put time and energy and resources into a tree if you're not going to get the fruit that you want to get out of it. So there's a need to contain the tree, to make the tree manageable to our needs. And that often involves height. There's a preferred height that we would like to maintain the tree at, and there's a preferred width that we would like to maintain the tree at. So that's going to vary depending upon your individual expectations for that tree. Accessibility. Do you want to be able to just have the fruit from the tree reachable? All you need to do is reach up and grab it. How far are you willing to go to harvest your fruit? Are you going to have to use a pole with the basket at the end to access that fruit? Are you going to have to get up on a ladder and access that fruit? These are questions that these are questions that need to be answered. And once you decide on the size of the tree that's right for you, then you're going to try to basically maintain the tree at that height. That's where the bulk of the pruning comes in. It's trying to constrain the tree to fit your own personal specifications. Let's see. Also, space can be an issue. So we, as you all know, we have different varieties. You can get a dwarf tree, you can get a semi-dwarf tree, you can get a standard tree. These are all options that you have that are going to meet your own particular requirements based upon the location where you're working. Espalier or container trees. These are other options. You can still, if you have limited space, you can still create a food garden for yourself. So you do have options. But as far as pruning goes, that's the biggest thing. Size control, making it manageable for you, getting the tree established. So we're basically talking about, for the rare fruit bearers, we're talking about everything. But we can basically talk about deciduous fruit trees, stone fruit, palm, or we can talk about citrus, we can talk about evergreen. There are certain styles, there are certain architectural shapes that over the years have been established and found to be very conducive for making the trees work within our expectations. In terms of, we'll start with fruit trees. We'll start with stone fruit trees. We can talk about a tree that has a central leader. So a classic example, an upright tree that, like a Christmas tree. A Christmas tree is a great example. You have one central column, one leader, and then you have branches coming off that trunk. Those are subordinate. The central leader is the tallest, and then the subordinate is the branches are subordinate in height. And in a perfect world, the farther you get out from the central trunk, the lower in height those branches are going to be. So we can have an example of like a modified central leader. Sometimes you could get a situation where you have a multi-stem, like a pomegranate seems to be a good example. A pomegranate, at least the pomegranates that I deal with, they put out a whole bunch of different stems. An example of modified central leader there would be, choose the stem in the center to be your central leader, and then all those other ones that are growing up, you can keep them slightly lower than the center stem, and as you go out, the height of those particular trunks get even lower. So that lends ultimately to a nice rounded shape. So the majority of our fruit trees are going to be pruned in that manner, central leader or modified central leader. When we get into the stone fruit trees, however, that's where we go into what's something called an open vase. And the analogy I use for an open vase would be when the tree's young. In response to your question, maybe you would make a pruning cut, or they would do it at the nursery. When the tree initially forms, they might make a cut and create a branching at that point, an outward branching. Imagine a cup hand. Cup your hand and hold it out like that. That would be an example of an open vase. We find that the peaches, the stone fruit just in general, because of their growing habit and how they respond to the sun and the external conditions, they grow and they produce very well with that shape. One exception would be olives. Olives, I believe, are also, we want to encourage our olives to assume the open vase shape. And now everything varies by region. Up in Washington, you're going to find apples, which down here we're going to prune in the modified central leader or central leader architecture. Up in Washington, they're going to be formed in open vase shape. So that has come about as a result of that shape has been proven to be the most productive for their needs up there. So everything varies by location. One of the cool things about, and also in terms of the constraints of or limitations of space, is there's another style called a modified open vase. and that is basically this idea of nesting. So you can have a large open vase on the outside, and then as you go inward towards the center of the tree, you can have concentric vases that are smaller, but they fit within the context of the larger vase that you've created. So that's another option for stone fruit. So we have central leader, modified central leader, open vase, modified open vase. Yes, question.
Question, like specifically around apples, you were talking about using a central leader or a modified central leader. And one of the things that I've encountered is, or tried to do, is when the apple is growing, to cut the main branch or the main stem, I could be correct the way you're calling it, to encourage, these lateral branches at wider crotch angles. But then my concern is that it's going to sort of an open base, and I'm concerned it doesn't have one of the new growth doesn't take over as the new leader. How do you deal with what's the best approach for that? Do you understand? Was I clear in what I was asking?
Yeah, so the question was an example of apple. If the tendency of the apple tree is to grow out in an open vase way, if we want to, rather than have it grow out like that, if we want to make it be a modified central leader, how do we keep the shape of the tree in conjunction with what our expectations are?
It's like you want it to be central leader, but you also want to promote those lateral branches, right? And so how do you encourage those lateral branches and still allow it to be central leader without cutting it?
Pruning can go a long way towards making that happen. You choose the branches that you want to grow in that particular way, or you could do in combination with manipulation, with pulling the branches down, or you figuring out a way to weigh. You don't have to pull the branches down. You can weigh the branches down. So you can use pruning to direct the branches. What you cut, you're typically cutting to a bud, or you're cutting to a branch that can become the new leader. So you do have a lot of control by the pruning cuts that you make, by how you shape the tree. Yes, question.
I have backyard trees. I'd like them to be 8 feet tall or 4 feet wide. Why let them grow big and then prune them down? Or walk by every few days and just pinch off the growth that's outside my imaginary box?
The question is, the gentleman in his backyard has a tree that he wants to keep at 8 feet in height and 4 feet in width. And does he do that all at once or over time?
I can pinch growth when it goes outside the box.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I can easily pinch the growth with my fingers when it goes outside the box as a little bud. If I let it grow, I'll need 3 shears. Cut it back.
And that's not what you want. You want it to.
If I imagine this box,
Yeah.
I can say every time I see a leaf from outside the box, just pinch it off.
Yes.
Is that good? Or is that...
It's. I mean, again, it's trying to force a tree to do something that it may not want to do. So yes, you can do it. You can absolutely do it. But if it's a vigorous tree, if it's going to fight you, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing it. But yes, it's okay to do. That leads into
The alternative is come back in the winter and cut off the 4-foot branch.
right. Yeah, I mean it's always. I think it's better to try. The earlier you can make these cut, the earlier you can start the process of implementing what you want. The better it's going to be. But depending upon the kind of cuts that you're making. So we can talk about types of pruning cuts. There's this will be in the context of answering your question. There are basically 3 types of pruning cuts, if you will. There's a heading cut, there's a thinning cut, and there is another cut which we'll call re-leadering. So a heading cut is, I think, what you're talking about. You're trying to keep the width of the tree set at 4 feet in width. So in order to do that, you're cutting away any growth that's going to go outside of that parameter. If you're, depending upon where you're making that cut, if you're just cutting anywhere along the length of that stem or branch, that's going to be a heading cut, and you'll get a reaction out of that. You'll get a lot of times you'll get new growth that's initiating from the point that you're making your cut, and so it's going to be a constant uphill battle because you're trying to limit it to a certain size or certain shape, and then you're making that cut, but you're creating more work for yourself. Better would be to find a bud or a branch that you can cut back to, and then you can that'll help you to keep it that size. If it's an apple tree, you can cut back to a spur. A spur is it's a modified branch, and a spur is where a lot of fruit is going to be produced. So if you had a type of tree that produced spurs that produced fruit that grew off spurs, you could leave that spur as your terminus, have that be at your 4 foot point, and always cut back to that. Then your fruit's going to be coming from there. But does that answer your question?
One's an apricot and one's a kumquat.
What's the difference?
Well, the apricot, I'm told, fruits at the edges.
Yes,
So
yes.
if I cut the edges off, am I going to lose all my fruit?
No, because the apricot will also produce spurs. The spurs are short-lived. We'll get back to that. You have a question?
Yeah, going back to stone fruits. I have a plum tree that has never produced fruit or anything. So when would be the best time to prune that versus a plum tree that has had fruit? Is there a good time for either one of them?
Well, first off, they should be grafted.
The plums.
The question is,
For plums, stone fruit.
two plum trees, one's producing, one's not?
Yeah, I mean, this one's like a younger tree, the other one's in the ground.
How old are the younger tree?
I think it's about 3-4 years, so I was trying.
4 years old and it hasn't produced fruit. Was it grown from seed?
I bought it from a nursery. It's still in a container.
Well, but it may have not been grafted. It could have had one where the graft failed and it grew.
Oh,
I have that. I've seen that before.
okay.
So
When's the best
So
time
the
to prune it?
question is two trees, plum trees. One's 4 years old and still has not produced fruit,
Yeah.
and the other has. And apparently, the 4-year-old tree that hasn't produced fruit is in a container.
Yes.
Okay, so that can be being in a container. That can limit it. A lot of times as well. It can take 3 to 5 years sometimes to put it once you put the tree into the ground. To actually produce viable fruit. A tree may still produce fruit once you put it in the ground, but the tree really, at that point, it's established, it's adjusting to its new home. So it's spending most of its energy trying to strengthen its trunk, strengthen its branches, spread out its roots to anchor itself, to have a solid foundation. Then it can start, once that base is covered, and the roots can farm the resources that it's looking for, nutrients and minerals and moisture, then it can start directing its energy into producing fruit.
Okay, but when is a good time for me to prune that tree then? Before it fruits or after the fruiting process? And then is it best in January or right now in October?
Okay, we'll get into that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I would. The question is, when is the best time for her to prune that tree, even though it hasn't been fruiting? I would treat it as a young tree, and I would try to. Now is going to be the optimal time to impart the architecture or the style that you want. So I wouldn't be so knowing that it's a new tree, having the expectation that it's really not going to produce for you for 5 years at least. Why not take the time now? Don't be so focused on getting production. be more focused on getting it off to the right start, doing the best thing that you can do for it, giving it the proper architectural shape, making sure those branch unions are strong, things like that. Let it get established. That would be the pruning direction that I would suggest. And you can do that really because you're not concerned about the production. You can do that at any time. The general time that we find ourselves pruning the fruit, pruning the deciduous fruit trees, generally speaking, is Thanksgiving to mid-February out here. Question over here.
Yeah, sir. Thank you for the class. Really informative. So this might be really elementary, but we're like younger gardeners, and we inherited a backyard full of really nice trees. And someone was nice enough to give us a bunch of like branches with different mangoes that we could like prune onto our around the trees. So my question is, how do you identify if they're not clearly labeled? And you need to go in, right? And you inherit a garden. How do you identify what tree is what?
What tree is what? Well, it depends on the time of year. If it's during the growing season, if it's producing fruit, then you'll be able to identify. If it's out of season and if there's no leaves on the tree, that can be harder. There are ways to do it. You can look at a lot of times on the branches, there'll be buds. The buds will be covered, but depending upon the shape and the orientation of the buds, you can use that as an ID. You can use that. You can use the bark of the tree as an idea. The general shape of the tree, the architecture. Is it an upright tree? Are the branches are there narrow crotch angles? Also, even if it's out of leaf, if you look on the ground, you can get an you can kind of get an idea based upon the leaves. You know what you have. So that's where I would. That's how I would do it.
Okay. As someone with like not a lot of experience, so would you just recommend to just not prune the tree and leave it and wait for fruit bearing season or see like what fruit it bears before we try to take care of it? Or would you recommend to roll up your sleeves, go and look at the leaves, look at the bark, look at the ground, and figure out what it is and prune it on time?
The latter.
The latter. Okay.
The latter thing that you said. It's always better to know what you're dealing with. Let's say you took the former approach. You just roll up the sleeves, started pruning it. Well, if you're asking, maybe you're asking a pear tree to try to assume the shape of an open base architecture. I don't think it's worth the effort. So it's much better to know the material that you're dealing with before making a decision.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion, at least. Question.
Well, I know Nathan's got another event coming along behind us. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to raffle off is we're going to raffle off this bag of buttons. All right, so ready to get started.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you all. Okay. The question was pruning in general, a general pruning question. Timing. Do we wait exclusively for that November, that Thanksgiving to mid-February time, or can we do pruning outside that time window? Thank you for the question. Depending upon the goal, the objective of the tree, the objective of what needs to be done. We also talk about the 4 Ds in pruning. So in terms of the health of a tree, we talk about 4 Ds. Dead, dying, diseased, and dysfunctional branches. Those are what we're targeting. You can prune the dead at any time of the year, not a problem. If it's a deciduous tree and you want to prune it in, say, February, you have to be cognizant of what are the consequences going to be. You can prune the tree, but are you going to be removing potential fruit? If so, are you going to be okay with not having as much fruit because you felt the need to prune. You know, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Timing. We correlate in the tree will, most of the time, the tree is going to respond to a pruning cut or wound. It's going to have a response. It might even generate some sap. And the sap is helpful. It's like a Band-Aid for us. It helps to seal the wound. It has antimicrobial properties. However, it is thought that sap gives off a pheromone, and that insects are tuned into that pheromone, and that becomes a target. That becomes a big welcome mat for them to come in and attack the tree. So a lot of times insect activity is correlated with heat. So if we're wanting to prune a tree that's going to respond by producing sap in the summertime at the height of insect activity, we may not want to do that. We may not want to expose the tree to that onslaught of insects. So in that case, I would wait until the tree's not producing sap to make the pruning cuts. So it's a matter, to answer your question, it's a matter of knowing how that particular tree is going to respond, and in terms of producing sap, and is it correlated at a time when there's going to be high insect activities? I know we're here to talk about fruit trees, but just as a general thing in arboriculture, we generally don't recommend pruning pine trees in the summertime for that very reason, because a tree's it's gonna bleed, it's gonna try to seal the wound, and then that's gonna bring in insects. The insects, what it is it's thought that the insects with fruit trees and normal non-fruit trees, the insects are they're gonna attack what they perceive as a stressed tree. If a tree is healthy and vigorous, it's really not going to be a target. It's when the insects determine that the tree is stressed. How would they determine that? Well, if they're sensing pheromones that are a source of stress, they're going to think, oh, it's going to be easier for us. The tree's defenses are going to be down. We're going to have an easier time. We're going to attack this tree. So that would be another consideration. A lot of people do like to prune during that winter window, because in terms of deciduous tree, the trunk is the canopy is bare. You can see the architecture. You can see much more clearly branch unions and cuts that need to be made. But and it's also easier to process your brush because there's not as many leaves on the branches. So that's a desirable time. But depending upon the severity, you can have an old tree that you feel needs to be pruned. Let's say it's an old tree with a very dense canopy. It's too dense. We have an insect infestation because the density of the canopy is too much. It's too great. We've attracted insects. We've attracted mites inside the canopy of this tree, and it's having a problem. We need to go ahead and prune the tree. You can do that, but there might be a consequence for that. If you're doing that in the height of summer, and then what you're reducing the tree. While it was dense, the canopy was dense. If you've opened it up too much, if that's a thin bark tree, you might be subjecting that tree to sun scald that it otherwise wouldn't have been subjected to if you had pruned at that time. So a lot of time, is that helping to answer your question? Okay. Question.
Excuse me, we have a couple online questions.
Yeah.
Ronnie wants to know, she has a Hachia persimmon that bears like crazy, but the branches keep breaking off. She did train the side branches to 90-degree angles, but after one main side branch broke off, she started supporting the other ones with garbage cans. Then the whole top of the tree broke off. How does she prune the tree to give it more strength? She doesn't have any problems with her Seijo persimmon.
Okay. Question was about a Hachia persimmon. My experience with persimmons in general is that they have a brittle wood. They're producing the fruit on like the current season's growth, and also I believe on 1-year-old growth. So persimmons are challenging. They're a heavy fruit. and the wood of the persimmon tree is inherently brittle. So I'm personally reticent to encourage supporting of the tree, but you may have to do that. So what she might have to do is minimize the load on the branches, even if the branch architecture is good, even if it's a nice 90-degree angle. She may want to reduce the length of the branches. She may want to reduce the fruit load. Yes, you can use props on trees to support limbs. There's a danger to that, and the danger would be the analogy I'll use is if we break our leg and we are on crutches, and we're utilizing the crutches while the leg heals. Let's say we never stop using those crutches. We become reliant on those crutches. We've never developed the strength and in the muscles of the leg to support our weight and to balance us. So the tree, it's the same thing. If you're going to use a prop on a tree, that's not just a short-term thing. That prop is always going to be there because the branch has become dependent on that. You can also not just use a prop. You can cable. You can support a tree using cables. So there are things that she can do in that regard. But probably what I would recommend is biting the bullet on production for a year and giving it a pretty dramatic haircut, scaling it back and to something that's manageable, and then restarting from that point. That would be the way that I would recommend it. But again, we're asking her to sacrifice. She probably loves the persimmons and has to wait every Thanksgiving rolls around, and then if she doesn't have persimmons, she's not going to be happy. But if she wants to ultimately keep it within the parameters that she's interested in, she might have to sacrifice a short-term gain for a longer-term benefit. Another question.
Yes.
Could I make a comment on that one? Because can I speak to that for 1 second? One thing that I've heard about persimmons specifically, or actually have seen be effective in this situation, is to bring the arms back so that they're shorter, so you don't have the long lever arm. That way you could actually have more fruit on the shorter. You don't have to thin back as much the fruit. So maybe, I don't know how long her branches are, but if they're really long, that
Yeah, absolutely. That was implied in my answer.
Okay,
Yeah, but if she does that, more than likely she is going to sacrifice a significant portion of that year's production. It wouldn't matter, I suppose. Timing of pruning, interesting. Some people might say to prune in the winter time. Everyone has an opinion. The Germans, for example, who've been doing tree care for quite a long time, if you think about it, a lot of Europeans, they've been at it a lot longer than us. They've deforested their land, and then they've had to learn how to reforest their trees. So I like to listen to the Europeans. What they suggest is if you are pruning, and this is in contrast to what I just said about summertime pruning, it's thought that the tree might respond better to a pruning wound if you do it at a time of active growth. So when would she want to prune her persimmon tree? When would she want to bring it back in? I would personally recommend after this year's fruit production, just go ahead, bite the bullet, bring it back. And she's going to have to compromise next year's production, but going forward, I think she'll be a lot happier. Okay.
We had another question. Which shape of pruning is recommended for guava and white sapote?
Guava and white sapote. I believe what we're wanting, if possible, is the central leader or the modified central leader.
We had another one. Cynthia wanted to know. She sees people put temporary crutches when the tree is fruiting, and then take them away when they're not fruiting. She's personally going for short fruit trees that are low to the ground maybe like a hedge most of the time, or understory trees under other trees.
Okay, and so that's her desired outcome. That's what she wants. I think it would start with either a dwarf stock or a semi-dwarf stock. That would be a place to start. The idea of yeah, if it's temporary, the temporary support, if it works, it's okay. I do think that it ultimately has an effect of weakening the tree because the tree becomes dependent on that. I think if possible, it would be better to, I think that's a pretty interesting question. I think me personally, rather than having a fixed support, like let's say a prop, that would be a good circumstance where a flexible kind of support, maybe even a bicycle tube attached to the branch in question, maybe attached at a higher point. If that branch has the ability to fluctuate and move, if it's not solidly locked in place, I think that would be better than actually just having a solid prop. But again, whatever works for people. Who am I to come in here and tell you this is how it should be? People who have been working with their trees, they know what's going to work, and they know what works for them. Tom Del Hotel, last night I spoke with him. He was giving me an example of a Aloha mango that a friend of his developed down in San Diego. He had used it at his place. He'd had the thing in there for 30 years. In 30 years, that thing produced fruit for him maybe 2 or 3 times. Whereas somebody else in very close proximity to him, maybe 10 miles away from him, extolled the virtues, loved the fruit, had no problem with it. No problem at all. Every year it produced abundantly. It was fantastic. So that person would say, oh yeah, the Aloha works really great in the inland San Diego area. Where Tom's experience would be like, well yeah, I've heard that the Aloha mango is fantastic, but his own personal experience was that didn't work out for him as well as other people. But yet, look at it, but it was such a very close area. So everyone's experience is going to be their own unique experience, their own unique place, conditions, microclimates, things like that. Another question in the back.
Just a comment on the bringing the size of the tree back to a manageable size. We had an overgrown semi-dwarf grapefruit, so we just cut, some of these big branches off, like one year, and then it was starting to. So we sacrificed the fruit on that one branch, but we still had the rest. So gradually we took off one big branch at a time, and then after 5 years, it was back down to the size we wanted, but we didn't sacrifice all the fruit.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you. That's wonderful input. I'm not sure if you heard that out there, but the lady had said, she gave an example of a semi-dwarf grapefruit that they needed to size reduce. They did it over a 5-year period, and they did it in such a way that they did not sacrifice a large amount of that production. So if you have the time, that's a great example. It doesn't have to be done all at once. We can work towards a result. Now sometimes it's better to take 2 or 3, 4 years to have something happen. The question is, do you have the patience? Do you have the time? Do you have the foresight to be able to make that happen? All too often, it could be like you're going for something, and someone comes along, your gardener or something like that, and they don't know what your intention is, and they cut something out, and you're like, man, they made a mistake, but they didn't know that you had a longer term plan. So if you do have a long-term plan, it's important to communicate that to people who would be involved in the care of the tree. Any more online questions?
No.
No. Okay. Yes, sir.
How about the local weather at the time you're pruning? You want to do it when it's hot, when it's cool, when? Is there a time, the weather conditions that you would rather prune?
Some trees are particularly susceptible. Up in the Bay Area, they talk about apricot trees that are susceptible to eutypa. So they're not doing any up there. Apricot trees are not pruned until about June. because of the conditions earlier than that are very conducive to that. I believe it's a fungal pathogen, and so they don't want to encourage that. So it would be, I think it's always good to know your product, know your trees, do your research, find out what are the specific pathogens and what are the specific pests that afflict that particular tree, and accumulate that information and use that to inform your decisions. Avocados, or citrus, generally thin bark trees. Do we want to prune them in the summertime? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. We don't want to, because why? Really, we're concerned about opening up the tree and exposing that tree to sunburn or sun scald. So, yes, certain particular ailments that are conducive to that particular tree, you would want to make sure that you're pruning in times when you're outside that window. What are the conditions that would allow for that particular pest or pathogen to predominate? You wouldn't want to prune during that time. And different kinds of pruning. Again, your pruning strategies for developing a young new tree are going to be different than let's say it's a backyard that's been neglected. Let's say, oh yeah, great, you put all these trees in, wonderful. And maybe it's not even conscious neglect. Maybe it's just like, yeah, these trees have produced wonderfully over the past 5-6 years, and then now we're noticing a diminishment of production. What's going on? Maybe there's a lot that could be happening there, but trees do need to be maintained. There's all sorts of specifications out there in terms of what percentage you can take off of the tree in any given year. Yeah, those are valuable. Those are very valuable. They're guidelines, but it's really a matter of what is it going to take for you to fulfill the expectations that you have of your particular tree.
You want some more?
Thank you. Also, an objective of pruning should be, generally speaking, we want light and air penetration. So with citrus trees, for example, great example. A citrus normal habit is to send out like an upright growth, and then from that upright growth, typically in the same season, you might get a little side branch which is going to produce fruit. So if that's constantly happening, the general tendency over time is you're getting a layer. You're getting so imagine the outer shell of the tree. That's happening. It grows, it goes down, and then it ends up like that. And then over time, repetition. Now you have a situation conducive to an onion, where you have layers upon layers. And so the tree, the citrus tree, has become dense. The canopy has become dense. The air is stagnant. There's dirt and dust can collect in there. It's a nice environment for mites to get in. Also, when that happens, when you have a dense outer shell of citrus, most of the fruit is going to be borne, but the heavy citrus fruit is going to be borne on the ends, which is increasing the lever arm, the weight of those branches. Now those branches become, even if you have a great architectural angle, they can become more susceptible to breakage. So in citrus in particular, we want to prune for light and air penetration, but it's a balance. It doesn't mean that we open it up. We don't prune a citrus in an open vase pattern, because we don't want to open that tree up so much to where now we subject that thin bark tree to sunburn and sun scald. So what's the balance? Well, God, that guy said to prune for light and air penetration, but keep it within reason. In the terms with citrus, what I would do is all that dense, like layers of an onion, I would eliminate every downward facing branch. I would go in there, I would open the tree up, I would lace it out. One of the tests that you can do